Chasing Leviathan is a podcast about pursuing truth, one big question at a time through the discipline of listening. Truth is too big to tame, but if we pay close attention, we might get the chance to glimpse something truly magnificent. So please join me in this pursuit, 1 week at a time. Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm your host, PJ Wehry, and I'm here today with Dr. Jack Zipes, Professor Emeritus of German, Comparative Literature, and Folklore at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. And Dr. Zipes, we're here today to talk about your book, Buried Treasures, The Power of Political Fairy Tales. And it's a real honor to have you. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me.
So tell me a little bit, I mean, it seems like this is your career, right? Like you have done a lot in children's literature, German Jewish culture, these sorts of things. But why this book in particular? Why political fairy tales?
Well, I wanted to sort of point out that fairy tales are not just these bedtime stories, sweet bedtime stories for kids. And I wanted to demonstrate that they really have a great deal to teach us about our own present-day conflicts and ideas and beliefs and so on. And so I chose approximately 10, if not 12, unusual writers who wrote during World War I and World War II, and who really have a great deal to offer us, and also who sacrificed their lives in trying to defeat fascism, both in the early part of the 20th century and also in the middle part of the 20th century.
Thank you. For our audience, when you say fairy tale, do you have a good, concise definition so they can get a feel for it? I feel like everyone kind of instinctively knows, right?
Yes.
But it all of a sudden it can get a little bit ethereal, right?
Right. Yeah, basically, you can't define what a fairy tale is because, in almost all the tales, like in the Brothers Grimm or Andersen and so on, there are no fairies in the tales. I swear.
Right.
The term came to being in approximately 1696 in France, and where the French began taking the oral tales, the peasant tales, or tales told by simple people, and they called them, and they were mainly women, very rebellious women in Louis XIV's court. And they called the tales contes de fées, which, literally speaking in French is fairy, contes de fées, tales about fairies. Now, in their tales that they told, fairies did appear. They were brilliant. They were just as good as the famous Charles Perrault, who is considered one of the great writers of fairy tales in the world, but they were just as good, if not better, than Perrault. As usual, women do not get their say, right?
Right.
And so people started liking, for instance, in Germany, the word for fairy tale is Märchen. Märchen means little tale. It doesn't mean anything about fairies and so on. So essentially, fairy tales borrow from all types of genres in a very imaginative, unique ways that really demonstrate in the telling of tales how powerful our imaginations are and what we can magically do, sort of in the spirit of fairies, to help us understand why we are in certain conflicts or jams, or why we want to love somebody, and so on and so forth. In other words, these were very unusual tales that people recognized. They didn't have to, nobody had to say, I'm going to sit down to you, dear, and tell you a fairy tale, before you go to bed, or in a circle in peasant homes and so on, things like that. So, I have written, long essays that outline, going back to the to the rise of myths. For instance, the word myth more or less means fairy tale. For the Romans and the Greeks and so on, the tales that they told were also extremely unusual, filled with imagination, with tremendous, let us say, suspense. And way before 1697, when conte fées was sort of developed, the Greeks and the Romans had their tales, and they were very similar to fairy tales. And nobody bothered definitions about what is a fairy tale.
Right. Even as you're saying this, and the next step is like you're talking about political fairy tales, but just that first mention of conte fées, like the rebellious women in Louis XIV's court, like immediately it's political, right? Like, there seems to be hints of that. Can you talk a little bit more about these rebellious women, like where that comes from, why they felt the need to draw these out?
Yeah. Well, if you recall that women were not allowed to have any professions in the 17th century, and they were highly educated. The upper classes, of course, and they were amazingly intelligent, and they knew how to play music and so on. And because they had tons of money, the richer ones, the aristocrats, they would have what they called salons at their homes, where people could perform, men and women together, stories, songs, music, and so on and so forth. And in these salons, they would take motifs or information from tales that the peasants were told, and they would modify them into really brilliant stories of different kinds. And so it was during this time in the 17th century, when Louis XIV was the sort of autocratic king in France and in Europe, that women began saying, we want to go beyond our homes. We want to tell tales that will sort of defend us and so on. So these tales are amazingly, in quotes, feminist, before the term feminist was coined. So they would tell tales, and they were all Catholic, of course. They were raised Catholic in France, but none of them believed in priests and the Catholic religion. And so their tales generally depict these amazing, powerful fairies that would punish male or female. One of the most famous writers was Madame d'O, and she wrote about 2 volumes of fairy tales, and there was a sort of like she influenced many of the other women at that time who also, wrote fairy tales. And so that was sort of the beginning of the labeling of these tales. Up to that time, they were simply called little tale, like in German, Märchen is little tale, not little fairy tale, but little tale. And so the French were the ones who added these I would call scurrilous and powerful fairies to their tales.
Yeah, and so one thing that does seem to stick out is like, for it to be a fairy tale, it at least has to be short, right? There has to be brevity.
Yes.
Yeah. Like you can't have a fairy tale novel. Though people have drawn them out now, like in fantasy, that's no longer a fairy tale. It's a novel drawn from that.
Exactly.
I might be barking up the wrong tree entirely, but from what I understand, part of the Grimm's motivation in collecting the German fairy tales was part of the effort of German unification and nationalism. Is that correct?
Yes. Yes, that makes a lot of sense. But we have to be a little careful about that because, some people have tried to label the Grimm's fascists or the early fascists of some kind. The Grimm's were actually from a middle-class family. They were born in the 1880s, and their father died when they were 11 and 12, and they really had to, let us say, fend for themselves at the university, at high school and university, and so on. And they felt this was also the time of the Napoleonic Wars. So France again plays a major role here, and they favored. They were democratics in quotes. They wanted, because they lost. They were not from the aristocracy, and they had lost their father, and they had to, show through their work how good they were, and they became professors later on in their lives. But they felt that the common people's voices formed let us say, basis of a culture in society, that we could actually learn a great deal about who we are and what we stand for, what we want to celebrate, how we want to plant fields or share work, and so on and so forth, so that the brothers Grimm really wanted to find. They wrote on many different themes. Even wrote the first dictionary in German, and so on and so forth. So they wanted to find stories that would celebrate all of the different states. There were at that time 300 principalities in Germany, and
right.
always fighting one another, right? And so eventually, the Brothers Grimm demonstrated that these tales could enable people to grasp, what is the significance of the celebrations of living together, working together, and so on and so forth. And initially, they thought that they could find the pure sort of German tales. That's where it gets a little dicey with regard to fascism and so on.
Right.
But they quickly learned that almost all the tales that they found from friends, colleagues sending them tales that they kept and redid and things like that. So these tales were coming from Italy, from Greece, from all over the world, practically. No, let us say the European world. And that there were similar beliefs, similar ways that people reacted to the same type of living conditions that they had in Germany. So in other words, they quickly realized after the first two books, they did 7 different editions, adding tales, distracting tales, and things like that. And they were smart and intelligent, and they realized that, hey, we're really doing international tales, that our books are not really German, even though they call them German tales, but they owe their existence to other countries and to other storytellers and things like that. And they never tried to define what a fairy tale was. They never insisted that they were Germanic and so on and so forth. They were just brilliant ethnologists, and they really understood how important language, stories, and so on were to various, let us say, societies or cultures. And that was a great sort of contribution to the rise of storytelling in Europe.
Absolutely. As I listen to that, it's a really inspiring story, and there's a reason the tales have endured. Now, one thing you mentioned about them, though, is this idea of this great imaginative aspect, that there's a lot of imagination involved.
Yes.
And in some cases, and maybe this is my own lack of understanding, it seems almost like there's an opaque symbolism. As an example, maybe this is an example of me being a poor parent, but I have just taken upon myself to read the original Grimm's fairy tales to my kids. And my oldest child, she's like, "Oh, I know Red Riding Hood." And we started reading Red Riding Hood. And of course, at the end, in the edition that we have, right? Because I think there's some slight differences, but the wolf gets its stomach cut open, Red Riding Hood comes out, Grandma comes out, and then they put stones in the wolf's stomach, sew it back up, and then the wolf wakes up, and then it dies from the stones in its stomach. And my oldest girl, she's looking at me and she's like, "Wait, what is that?" And I'm like, I did this to bother you. I'm not going to lie. I am not maybe the best parent. But the other side to it is I really enjoy that aspect of the tales, like the things like the stones in the stomach and that sort of thing. But I have no idea what's going on, right? Is there some explanation for that, or is that just part of the imaginative aspect, that like there's something that has been carried through kind of opaquely through the tradition?
Yes. Yeah. No, it's definitely very imaginative, because in the original, I won't say the original, but in the going back to Charles Perrault in 1697, he was the first, let us say, educated writer who wrote his version of Little Red Riding Hood that he got from peasants, probably. And in his tale, however, the wolf eats up Little Red Riding Hood, and she dies because, and there's a at the end of the tale, little girls who invite wolves into their parlors deserve what they get. Okay, so so then you have to think, and now there are at least 1,000, and I'm not kidding you, 1,000 up to today and throughout the world, maybe 1,000 or more versions of Little Red Riding Hood. My argument is that certain fairy tales become mimetic, memes. They become memes because they provide information that are crucial for the survival of human beings. And if we look at Little Red Riding Hood carefully, it's a tale about rape. It's a tale about a little girl. Okay, and of course, in those times, no matter what the society was, girls were not supposed to go out without any guard, not a guard, anybody accompanying them.
Right.
And if
a chaperone,
they did,
guardian, yes,
exactly. And if they went into the woods by themselves, then they were liable to be raped and that if you accept that, and I hope you will, as my interpretation, and I've written about it a great deal, then it's really interesting to see that up through today, the tendency in most of the endings has now switched to the girl getting the better of the wolf. And why, of course, it has to do with the change in the society's let us say, not laws, but customs. And that we have now feminism. Women have come into their own. They won't stand for this. And in fact, some of the greatest writers today of fairy tales, not just based on the Grimms or anything, have been women. They've really come into their own and asserted themselves. And so if you go into any store that has maybe selling 20 different titles of Little Red Riding Hood or so on, you'll see there's a remarkable ending in each one of the tales. And so that's what makes these tales really exciting. And you also see the politics changing. And, in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, men determine the lives of women, and that's not how we live today.
Right.
And if you dare to write a story that harks back to little girls who invite wolves into their parlors deserve what they get, you will be criticized, or
right.
you will be questioned.
And rightfully so, right? Like that's
Yes.
what we don't want. Yeah, absolutely. And this is something I read 15 years ago, and I haven't been able to find the book since. But in a very similar vein, I remember reading some cultural criticism that said the same thing about werewolf stories and vampire stories. That vampires were about nobles and how you couldn't trust them coming to seduce you at night. Like they always come at night, and they come in their carriage, and they come through the window, and they're mesmerizing, they're good looking and charming. And then werewolves are people that but at certain times, if you venture out at night, by the light of the full moon, they all of a sudden become these hairy beasts. And it's really interesting. Like, as soon as I saw that, I was like, I mean, even like, the very simple, like, vampires hate garlic, right? All of a sudden you're like, well, if you ate a lot of garlic or rubbed it around your neck, that would put off some noblemen, right? And so, right. Are you familiar with that? Like, is that something like? I mean, I have not been able to find that since. So,
yes, yeah, the very unusual. Like I said, fairy tales are unusual imaginative tales, and they deal with situations that bother people, or people want to celebrate them, certain things, and they find their own narrative way to express themselves. And some people are better storytellers than others, or writers, and so we have a really amazing. Throughout the world, amazing types, and a lot of scholars have noted these things and written books or developed catalogs or indexes, and so it's exciting. It's an exciting field, and you learn a lot, not only about society but about yourself when you read these tales.
Yeah, I even just to push it a little further, just like you said, like Little Red Riding Hood, it's often been the other way. Like vampires and werewolves are now they have happy endings, right? Like it's not that you're like taken away. It's that it's kind of interesting. You almost see like the ascendancy of the Beauty and the Beast model, where the beauty tames the beast, and like, I mean, not that I am a Twilight fan by any means, but like this idea that like the beauty can tame even this beast is kind of just a fascinating idea.
Right.
but I don't want to take away from the main thrust of your book. I mean, this has
Yes.
been fascinating to
No,
me.
no problem.
Yeah.
No problem.
But you focused on World War I and World War II political fairy tales.
Yes.
Do you mind expounding on that a little bit?
Yes. You know, the dark days, not that we have very bright days right now, but in the early first half of the 20th century, there were two world wars, and during these wars, people had to try to find their own way to present what is happening, and to also disguise their critiques of, let's say, Hitler, Mussolini, or and they used then symbolical artworks and literature and so on and so forth, and people. And by the time the 20th century arrived, more people had learned to read. Up until the 20th century, about half of the world couldn't read, if not more than half. And so, but people, artists, intellectuals, creative people, you name it, or just the ordinary people, had to find different ways sometimes to communicate with what they were feeling, what they were seeing, and so on. And so, and they wanted to sort of protest against a lot of the things that were going on in both world wars. And so it was really during and quite often these people were either executed or had to flee their countries. None of them in my book. I discuss about 12 to 13 really great fairy tale writers and artists. None of them wound up in the country into which they were born. They either fled to America, they fled to Norway, or were killed, and so on. And so I wanted to demonstrate that these tales were really substantial or significant for what they had to say about what was going on in the world at that time, and that they risked their lives, to do what they did. So that's what I think drove me, to write about all of these particular authors.
I love that, because it's easy to be dismissive of stories and their power, but when you see people who are persecuted and chased from their homes because of like, on the one hand, it's a story of courage, of their courage, and also it's something that illustrates the power of what they're doing, right?
Yes.
Like, like you don't chase someone away who's not who's just sitting there, right? Like they're like, this is like obviously causing a problem for these fascists.
Yes.
Now there are many of these that I want to ask about, but the one that I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't, I think everyone will be familiar with. Tell me a little bit about Bambi and Bambi's courage, this idea of Felix Sultan and his
Yes.
dilemma.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Now, okay, we have to begin with that Bambi was written between 1920 and 1922, came out in 1923. So this is a novel not written for children, by the way, okay? Felix Sultan was always angry at the critics who thought that this was a children's book, and it never, ever was written that way. It was really sort of an symbolical autobiographical novel about his own life. He was Bambi, and Bambi was Felix Sultan. And so this particular novel really reflects the pogroms There were 300,000 Jews after World War I killed because Europeans, the Germans and the Austrians, felt that the Jews had betrayed Germany or Austria. And so, and a lot of the Eastern European countries literally had these pogroms for about in the early part of the 1920s. And so we have to, Felix Salten was a journalist, and he was not a dummy. He may have had other, faults or what, and so on, but it's quite clear, and many other critics have agreed with me and have demonstrated that indeed this is a novel, about pogroms where men go into the forest and just out of pleasure shoot animals and cause them to die. And so he really demonstrated the very difficult situation that people were in at the end of World War I, and also demonstrated what it forecast to a certain extent what was to come in terms of the Holocaust. Now, he didn't do this in any pedantic way. He did it in a really brilliant way in which he also questioned himself, because he himself used to like to hunt animals, and he would only kill, as he tried to say, animals if they were going to be eaten, and so on and so forth. Not like many other hunters who just do it for the coat or something like that, for the skin. And so Salten became famous quickly because he touched a nerve in all of Europe, not just in Vienna or in Austria, he was Austrian, or Germany or the rest of Europe, but also in America. When the book was translated in 1928, the book did extremely well. There was the Book of the Month Club, of course, which helped, and that was the beginning of these book clubs that made a lot of money, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, people sort of saw something in that story. The difficulty with Bambi, of course, is that the anti-Semitic Disney, who was not really, couldn't read English or German, had decided to make his own film out of that, in which he celebrated himself as Bambi, and it is a putrid film, and it came out in 1942, and it's really, if you go and watch it, I'll bet you that you won't stand more than 5 or 10 minutes of the film, and he really destroyed Salten's name. Again, remember, Salten did not create this for children. This is a serious film about what happens to minority groups who are marginalized, and the other classes, social classes, kill them. So he's a very contradictory writer, because Salten himself he was Jewish and wanted to become like Christian aristocrats and so on. And he learned, however, that the Nazis were going to kill him in the 1930s and fled to Switzerland. And that's where he spent the last years of his life. So it's very interesting. The research that I did on this book really taught me many, many new things.
Yeah, absolutely. Even as I'm glad you mentioned it, because I was going to ask, I was like, wait, so if this is about pogroms against the Jews, how, Disney kind of famously anti-Semitic, as a studio, especially Disney himself. And then thank you for, I'm trying to get over, you called Bambi a putrid movie. That makes me laugh. But
Watch it, please. Please watch it.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen it before, but I hadn't seen it through these lenses, and so
Yes.
that'll be interesting. Um, Also, really fascinating to see. There is a long history, many examples of people taking serious literature and because of its subject matter, assuming it's children's literature. One that comes to mind is Watership Down by Richard Adams. I don't know if you're familiar with the book, but and of course, I mean, I read that as a young child, and I was I was like, this is not, this is a disturbing book, and so it's just really fascinating to watch these sorts of things unfold. Um, is there as you walk through, who are some of the other examples of kind of these brave fairy tale creators, fairy tale collectors that you would want to highlight?
Uh, well, there's another in the 1930s. There was a brilliant illustrator. He wasn't a writer. He was his name is I've written about him in this book, Ralph Brandt, Brandt, Ralph Brandt, and he was born into a very exceedingly wealthy German family in Hamburg, in Germany, in approximately, I think, at the beginning of the 20th century, and because he was his father was a merchant, wealthy merchant. They had a huge company, and part of that was in England. England and Germany at the beginning of the 20th century were in good terms always, and so this young man, Ralph Brandt, grew up in Germany, but because he was born, his parents conceived him in England, and so he was British also. He had double nationality, and so he and his brother, who's very famous and as a photographer, he began to study art in Europe and in Switzerland, and traveled about, and he also wanted to become an actor. And eventually, when Hitler came to power, he hated Hitler and fled because the family had, an estate in England. He returned to England, swearing that he would never, ever return to Germany. And he began doing brilliant artwork, and he also illustrated the Grimms and other fairy tales and brought out the absurdity of certain situations. Brilliant, really, really amazing artist, and he quite often did work in pencil, in ink, and so on. And during the 1930s, about 38, he was asked. He joined the resistance. He also joined the Communist Party in England at that time, and that was okay because at least the English didn't think all communists were traitors or anything like that. They actually, they were socialists, and he was asked, because he had a German passport, to rescue Jewish citizens from Hamburg and bring them to England. And so for 2 or 3 years, he risked his life, even he was an artist, because he felt so dedicated and committed to, to saving people. He was dedicated to humanity. And his artwork is noted, in England, and unfortunately not so much in America. And he was one of the artists I've discovered. But there were many others who did work in Britain, in Great Britain, that we don't know about, who also some of them were feminists, some of them were, socialists and whatever. But their artwork was to a certain extent an expression of their political ideologies. And that's why the book talks about fairy tales as political tales.
Yeah, absolutely. And forgive me for glancing off to the side. I had never heard of Ralph Brandt, and I was bringing up his. I was not expecting the artwork they have. It's brilliant, and it's more. And I might be getting the term wrong. Surreal than I was expecting.
Yes,
is that the right term? Yeah, it's very interesting.
Right.
Also, in some ways, not what I would think of for Grimm's fairy tales. I have the Arthur Rackham illustrations for the one that I have for the kids.
Totally different.
Completely different. Like those are like old, like they have this like old feel to them. This is I love the challenge that these provide. Very, very fascinating. Sorry, I got caught up in looking at these different paintings. So you mentioned Ralph Brandt. You mentioned, you have this collection of 13. As we look at, tell us a little bit about Lisa Tetzner. I love this characterization of the naive and idealistic revolutionary, right?
Right.
And so, can you draw a little bit about her for us?
Yeah. No, she was actually. Again, she was born, the late 19th, early 20th century, and she had a leg that was. She was never paralyzed, but she had tremendous problems throughout her life with one of her legs. But she came from a very conservative German family and met a communist, a German communist, and they got married at the beginning of the 1920s. And she then began, because she was a storyteller and traveled, she actually learned a lot of the tales by going from town to town and writing them down, and became one of the foremost writers of fairy tales for children, and also wrote a play that a Hungarian playwright, Balázs, who's also in the book. They teamed together and wrote a play about a young boy who is starving in a poor family, proletarian family, and he goes out one day to get some milk for the family and meets a big talking rabbit who wants to educate him and takes him on his back, and they fly through the world and to different places where the wars are going on, and he learns how important it is for all people to be fed, and so on and so forth. And it's a brilliant play. And she continued writing tales that the Nazis objected to. So where did they go? 33, Switzerland.
Yeah.
And she and her husband continued writing there, and eventually they never wanted to go back to Germany, although I think they visited one time. But after the war, they were still considered one of the foremost writers of children's literature.
Amazing. And so you're talking about comes from a conservative German family, meets communist, marries a communist. So did her plays carry this communist tendency throughout them?
No, not really. There were people who were loyal party members, but communism became Stalinized unfortunately, in the 1930s and 40s, and people left the party and, remains, basically in their way of living socialist, but they stopped aligning themselves with a particular party. And that's what happened with them. that they realized that the world was much more complex than they thought.
And so maybe, and that, I think that's a great lead in here. What I'm trying to understand is, where's the naive and idealistic revolutionary part come in? Is it just that they're pushing against the Nazis, or was there something, a particular theme?
They hoped that despite what happened with Russia, despite many difficulties, they continued to have this vision of a world in which people are humane, and they kept writing from that perspective, even though things didn't work out that way.
Yeah, and that's very helpful. Thank you. I'm not going to lie. When you first started talking about them, and you talk about this conservative German woman marrying this communist German man, I had images of Fiddler on the Roof. The second, I can't remember the second couple, but what I do remember, because it always makes me laugh so much, is the second couple. The man is a communist, and Reptevia asks him to teach his daughters, and he's telling the story of Jacob and Laban, and they come up, and Reptevia comes up, and and of course he goes, and Laban tricks Jacob, and the moral of the story is, never trust your employer. And so that's more what I had in mind when you first. So thank you for that clarification, and just tried to figure that out. I want to be respectful of your time, of course. As a last one, I see the violent, in air quotes, pacifist, Emery Kellen. Can you talk to us a little bit about him? Or is that
about whom?
Emery Kellen?
Oh, yes. Oh, Emery Kellen. Whoa. Wonderful man, amazing man. Also Hungarian Jew, who went to, eventually, he fought in World War I and for Germany, and wound up in Munich after the war, and studied art in Munich, and became a great caricaturist. And the war transformed him into a pacifist. He, fought in the trenches. He was wounded. He managed to stop fighting once he was wounded, and then he pretended that he was nuts, and flapped his wings and things like that. And they had to move him to a mental. A hospital that dealt with people who were mentally ill. And so he spent the last part of the war in a hospital that saved his life. And then he wound up in Munich in 1919, 1920, and he began studying to be an artist. And he became really a brilliant political caricaturist, and worked with a good friend of his, I'm forgetting his friend's name. At any rate, they were both Hungarian Jews, and they went and in those days, when not the United Nations, what was before the
League?
Yeah,
the League of Nations?
Yes, yeah. League of Nations. Well, so they needed they couldn't have photographers, but they could have caricatures in the meetings and so on. And they, for almost 15 years in Switzerland, became these brilliant caricaturists. And some of the caricatures were of Hitler and Mussolini and so on. So when 1933 came, they had to think about where they were going to go. And
that didn't go over well, caricaturing? No. Okay. Yeah.
I think that Mr. Hitler didn't approve
Didn't appreciate that? Yeah.
But their artwork was actually in Esquire. And in other words, it wasn't just in Europe. And so fortunately, they had friends. And in 1938, they went to New York. And in New York, Kellen continued to illustrate all sorts of tales, mainly for children, because he was concerned about their education. And one of the books I've translated and also republished was about Yusuf the ostrich, and about an ostrich in North Africa in the 1930s or 40s, who saves Americans who are in the continent in Northern Africa and so on. And it's brilliant, and I've republished it and redid it to a great extent. And his daughter lives in Washington, the state of Washington, and I contacted her for permission to do this. And so there were other books he's written that he was a dedicated pacifist, and it was not. He was really clear. It's really clear the message in almost all of the artwork. His wife was a writer and helped him. His Hungarian background didn't help his English, so
understandable.
She helped with the writing of the text. But he did 3 or 4 other books that I've collected, and he also wrote a biography about his trail from Hungary to Germany to the United States. Very amazing, admirable man.
One, I can see why you wrote about this, and I kind of love that. We gave a kind of a smattering of some of the people you write about, but to get the full feature, of course, people should buy your book. But I want to be respectful of your time, and I want to leave our audience with something. If you could leave, well, first off, it's been a joy having you on. I've really enjoyed talking to you today. What is one takeaway you'd leave for our audience as they go about their week that they can think about?
Well, we're living in really brutal times, and in all sorts of, we have wars in Europe that are unfounded, that dictators are on the rise, and even I think in the United States there's a danger of fascism raising its ugly head. So I hope that people can realize that through our understanding of literature, of art, of education, schooling, and so on, that we can live together and try to enable one another to survive and become clear-headed, and to enjoy this great universe instead of destroying the air around us and the climate and so on and so forth. So we're living at a very pivotal time. I'm 80. I'll be 86 tomorrow. And
happy birthday!
Thank you. And I'm somewhat sad. Not happy, because I think we have to turn things around. I think we have to develop a sense of compassion for one another, and to try to help those who have, let us say, less than we might have, to find ways to help them enjoy what we have on this earth. So that's about it.
Yeah, and that is the power that stories have. Dr. Zipes, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for coming on today.
Great. Thank you for inviting me.